The night was torn apart by the sound of thunder mixed with the clash of metal and the cries of the wounded. It was not Earth that suffered, but a world hidden in the edges of the galaxy where two races had already been at war for years. Smoke rose from broken homes and burned fields, and rain fell hard over shattered glass and ruins. In the middle of it all, a human mechanic named Daniel stumbled into the wreckage of an old workshop, his clothes soaked, his hands clutching the heavy wrench that had kept him alive. He was no soldier, but the war had pushed him into battles he had never wanted. Inside the ruined workshop, he froze. On the floor lay a tall alien woman with deep blue skin and graceful features, her body bleeding from wounds that were too many to count. Her breaths came shallow and broken, but her eyes still glowed faintly with life. Beside her stood a small alien child, no older than 7, holding a jagged blade with trembling hands. Her eyes, bright and filled with fire, locked on Daniel as if he were the last threat in the universe. Her voice cracked but carried strength as she whispered words that cut through the sound of the storm. She asked if his tools would be kinder than the swords that had already destroyed her family. Daniel's heart shook. He had seen fear before, but never a child standing against him with such raw courage. He lowered his wrench slowly, showing the child he meant no harm. Yet he knew trust would not come easily. The child was desperate, and her mother's blood stained the ground. Behind them, in the shadows, a robotic hound with glowing eyes shifted its stance, gears humming and wires sparking as it guarded them both. The machine did not attack but watched him closely, ready to strike at the first wrong move. The rain poured through broken windows, hitting the floor where metal and glass lay scattered. Daniel set the wrench on the ground and lifted both hands in a sign of peace. He spoke softly, telling the child he was not a soldier, not here to fight, but a man who fixed what was broken. His words barely reached her ears, but the child's hand shook as she glanced between him, the dying mother, and the loyal robotic dog. For a moment the silence stretched, broken only by thunder and the drip of rainwater. The mother's hand rose weakly, her fingers trembling as she gestured toward Daniel. Her lips parted, forming words he could not understand, but the meaning was clear. She wanted him to help, not fight. The child's grip on the blade loosened, though her eyes still burned with suspicion. She stepped closer to her mother, pressing her small body against the woman's side as if shielding her from everything in the world. Daniel knelt slowly, pulling a leather pouch from his belt filled with medical tools and bandages. He had used them on machines more often than on people, but in war he had learned that saving lives was not too different from repairing engines. The robotic dog's head tilted, glowing eyes fixed on his every movement. Daniel worked carefully, cleaning wounds, binding them as best as he could, whispering steady words even though he was unsure if they understood him. He wanted them to hear the tone more than the meaning, the voice of someone who cared. The child lowered her blade at last, though she never let it fall from her hand. Her eyes followed him with suspicion, but there was also a spark of hope that refused to die. Outside, the sounds of soldiers echoed in the distance. The war was not finished, and danger was moving closer with every second. Daniel knew he had only stepped into something larger than himself. Yet in the glow of the child's eyes and the fragile breath of the mother, he felt a duty stronger than fear. His tools were all he had, but tonight they would have to be kinder than any sword. The storm outside grew heavier, and the ruined workshop felt smaller with every strike of thunder. Daniel worked quickly, pressing bandages against the mother's wounds, but he could already tell it was not enough. The blood would not stop, and each breath she took was weaker than the last. His hand shook slightly, though he tried to hide it. He was a mechanic, not a doctor, yet something inside told him he had to keep going. The child stood close, her dagger still clutched tightly, her eyes never leaving him. She was ready to defend her mother even if it cost her life. The robotic dog shifted closer, metal claws scraping against the wet floor. Its glowing eyes scanned Daniel as though reading his every movement, judging if he was a danger or a savior. Daniel muttered under his breath, almost to himself, about how even machines could show more loyalty than most soldiers he had seen. He wondered who had built such a creature and why it protected these two with such devotion. The child noticed his glance toward the dog and pressed her hand against the machine's side, as if to remind him where its loyalty truly belonged. The mother stirred, her eyes flickering open for a moment. She whispered words in her alien tongue, and the child leaned close to hear them. Daniel could not understand the language, but he felt the weight of her tone. The child's expression hardened, as if she had been given a command she did not want to follow. She raised her chin and looked at Daniel with new fire, as though her mother's dying wish had placed something heavy on her shoulders. Daniel decided to break the silence. He asked gently what her name was, hoping to bridge the gap. The child hesitated, her lips parting slightly before she whispered something soft and melodic. He repeated the sound clumsily, earning a flash of surprise in her eyes. For the first time, the dagger lowered toward the ground, not as a sign of trust, but as a sign of exhaustion. She was just a child, caught in a storm of death and war, forced to act braver than her years allowed. A distant boom shook the ground, and through the broken windows Daniel saw a faint glow rising in the distance. Soldiers were burning their way through the ruins, sweeping each building in search of survivors. Time was slipping away. Daniel clenched his jaw, knowing that staying here meant death for all of them. He told the child firmly that they had to move, that her mother would not survive if they stayed. His words were rushed, but the urgency in his voice reached her. She shook her head fiercely, clutching her mother's hand, refusing to leave. Her eyes glistened with tears she had fought so hard to hold back. The robotic dog growled in a metallic tone, its sensors flashing as it detected movement outside. Daniel cursed under his breath. If the soldiers found them now, the wounded mother and the child would be slaughtered without mercy. He pulled the bandages tighter, lifted his wrench again, and looked at the child. He told her that if she wanted her mother to live even one more hour, she had to trust him enough to leave. His voice cracked at the end, but it carried the raw weight of truth. The child stared at him, her small body trembling with fear and rage. For a long moment it seemed she would refuse. Then her mother coughed violently, blood on her lips, her hand reaching out once more. The girl pressed her forehead to her mother's and whispered something softly, a promise Daniel could not understand. When she rose, her face was wet with tears, but her grip on the dagger was steady again. She gave him a single nod, the smallest sign of fragile trust. Daniel exhaled with relief, though the battle outside was closing in fast. He reached for the mother carefully, the robotic dog lowering itself as though ready to help carry her weight. Together they prepared to leave the ruins, every second echoing with danger. The storm outside was merciless, but what hunted them in the darkness would be far worse. The rain pounded harder as Daniel pushed open the broken door of the workshop. Cold wind rushed in, carrying the smell of smoke and ash. He half expected soldiers to be waiting outside, but the street was empty for now. The child clung to her, mother's hand refusing to let go, while the robotic dog crouched beside them with its glowing eyes scanning the night. Every sound echoed too loudly in the storm. Every shadow looked like a trap. Daniel felt the weight of fear pressing down, yet he forced himself forward. Survival meant movement, not hesitation. The mother was too weak to walk, her breathing shallow and uneven. Daniel bent down and lifted her as carefully as he could, his muscles straining under her weight. She was taller and heavier than any human woman, her body limp against his arms. The child moved beside him, dagger still in her hand, her small feet splashing through the puddles. The robotic dog patted at their side, its mechanical body whirring softly, keeping step with uncanny precision. The ruined streets stretched ahead, lined with shattered walls and collapsed buildings. Fires burned in the distance, casting an eerie glow across the sky. Daniel's mind raced. He had no clear plan, only the desperate thought of finding shelter where soldiers would not look. He knew this city once had underground tunnels, old service routes beneath the factories. If they still existed, they could hide there until the search passed. A sudden crash echoed from behind them. The child stiffened, her ears twitching as she looked over her shoulder. Through the sheets of rain, figures appeared, armored soldiers sweeping through the wreckage with rifles glowing red in the stormlight. They were hunting survivors, and now they were closing in. Daniel cursed under his breath and quickened his pace. The child's breathing grew fast, her grip on the dagger tightening until her knuckles turned pale. The robotic dog growled in a low mechanical tone, its sensors flashing. Daniel ducked into a narrow alley, his boot splashing through the water. He pressed his back against the wall, shielding the mother's body from the rain as much as he could. The child pressed close to him, her eyes wide with fear but still refusing to let go of her weapon. The robotic dog crouched at the alley's mouth, scanning the shadows for movement. Soldiers' voices carried faintly over the storm, harsh and sharp. They were getting closer. For a moment, Daniel's thoughts drifted to his old life. He had once fixed engines in quiet hangars far from the sound of war. He remembered the hum of machines, the smell of oil and metal, the peace of knowing his work saved lives without risking his own. Now he was here, caught in a war not his own, carrying a dying alien woman and trying to shield her child from death. He wondered what strange twist of fate had brought him to this place, but there was no time for answers. The mother stirred faintly in his arms, her lips moving in soft words he could not understand. The child leaned closer, listening. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she nodded, whispering back with trembling words. Daniel could not catch the meaning, but he felt it in his chest. The mother was giving her strength to her daughter, passing her will into the hands of a child who should never have carried such a burden. The soldier's footsteps grew louder. Daniel scanned the alley, searching desperately for escape. His eyes landed on a half-buried grate at the far end, rusted but still intact. He moved quickly, setting the mother down gently, then pried at the grate with his wrench. The metal groaned, refusing at first, then broke free with a sharp crack. Below, darkness yawned, a tunnel just as he had hoped. He gestured for the child to climb down first. She hesitated, her glowing eyes staring into the dark. But then she nodded and slipped into the tunnel, the robotic dog following right after. Daniel lifted the mother again, lowering her carefully before climbing down himself. The tunnel was damp and cold, the air heavy with the scent of mold and old machinery. It was no sanctuary, but it was hidden. Above them, soldiers passed by, their boots splashing through the alley. One paused near the grate, shining a red beam of light across the ground. Daniel held his breath, clutching the wrench tightly, ready to strike if they looked closer. But the beam moved away, and the soldiers marched on. Only when their voices faded into the storm did Daniel allow himself to breathe again. In the darkness of the tunnel, the child pressed close to her mother, whispering soft words while the robotic dog stood guard. Daniel sat against the wall, soaked and exhausted, but he knew this was only the beginning. The war outside would not wait for them to rest. Somewhere in the shadows ahead lay their only chance to survive. The tunnel was colder than the storm above. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the smell of rust and rot. Water dripped from pipes overhead, echoing in the dark. Daniel adjusted, his grip on the wrench as he walked ahead, his eyes scanning for danger. Behind him, the robotic dog padded silently, its glowing eyes cutting through the shadows. The child moved close to her mother, who lay weak and shivering on the ground. The girl's dagger glinted faintly, her small hand tight around the handle as though letting it go would mean losing everything. Daniel knelt beside the mother, checking her bandages. Blood had soaked through again, darker now, and her breathing was even more fragile. He felt his chest tighten. Machines he could fix, but life slipping away in front of him felt like a problem too great for any tool. Still, he pressed clean cloth against her wounds, whispering steady words he hoped would calm both mother and child. The child's glowing eyes watched him carefully, every movement judged, but her suspicion had softened into something closer to hope. They moved deeper into the tunnels, the sound of the storm fading until only their footsteps and the drip of water remained. The silence was dangerous. Daniel knew soldiers might sweep these routes eventually, but for now, it was their only refuge. He asked the child quietly if she knew where the tunnels led, but she only shook her head. Her language was strange, yet her meaning was clear. She had no map, no safe path, only her mother's weak hand to follow. The robotic dog stopped suddenly, its head lifting, gears humming. A low mechanical growl rumbled from its chest. Daniel froze, raising his wrench. From the darkness ahead came faint noises, scrapes, then whispers. Shadows flickered against the tunnel walls. For a moment he feared soldiers had found them, but as the figures stepped closer, their shapes were not human. A small group of aliens emerged, their skin the same shade of blue as the mother and child. Their armor was battered, their weapons dull from use, but their eyes carried the sharpness of survivors. They stopped when they saw Daniel, their gazes narrowing as they spotted the wrench in his hands and the human face beneath the dim light. One raised a weapon, ready to strike. The child cried out suddenly, her voice echoing in the tunnel. She stepped forward, placing herself between Daniel and the group. Her dagger lifted, not at him this time, but in defense of him. The alien soldiers hesitated, confused by the sight. The mother stirred weakly on the ground, lifting her hand as if to confirm her daughter's choice. The tension hung heavy in the air. Daniel raised his free hand slowly, showing he had no weapon but the wrench. He said he was not their enemy, his voice steady, though his heart raced. The soldiers muttered among themselves, their eyes shifting between the human, the dying mother, and the child who stood firm. At last, one lowered his weapon slightly, though suspicion never left his face. They moved closer, speaking quickly in their tongue. Daniel caught nothing of their words, but he read their expressions well enough. They were torn between killing him and helping their own. The child's small body trembled, but she did not step aside. Her courage, so fragile yet so fierce, forced the soldiers to pause. Finally, one of them knelt beside the mother, checking her wounds with practiced hands. His expression darkened. He looked up at the others and spoke grimly. Daniel did not need translation. The meaning was clear. The mother would not survive without more than bandages. Something stronger was needed, something they did not have here. The soldiers argued, their voices rising in frustration. The child's eyes filled with tears as she looked from her mother to Daniel, as if silently asking if his tools could truly be kinder than their swords. He clenched his wrench, thinking hard. Somewhere in these tunnels there had to be abandoned stations, maybe even supplies left behind from old wars. If he could reach them, maybe he could build what was needed to keep her alive. He rose to his feet, determination replacing doubt. He told them he would find a way, even if none of them believed him yet. The soldiers stared, uncertain. The child looked at him, her tears glowing in the dim light, and for the first time, she whispered his name. The tunnels stretched deeper into darkness, their walls lined with rusted pipes and broken cables. Daniel carried the dying mother again, her body growing colder with each step. The child walked close, her dagger clutched, but her eyes fixed on him now more than on his weapon. The group of alien survivors moved ahead, whispering among themselves, their voices sharp with doubt. They had seen humans only as enemies, yet here one carried their kin with a care that unsettled them. The robotic dog led the way, its sensors glowing brighter as it scanned the path. Every so often it stopped to growl at shadows that were not there. Daniel felt his nerves stretch thin, but he forced himself forward. He had promised the child with his eyes, if not with words, that he would not let her mother die without trying. His mind worked like it did in a workshop, piecing together problems and searching for parts he did not yet have. Somewhere down here, maybe in an abandoned control station, he might find what he needed. The tunnel opened suddenly into a wide chamber. Broken machines lay scattered across the floor, their once bright panels dark with age. Old generators, cracked screens, and shelves of useless scrap filled the space. To the soldiers, it looked like a graveyard of rust. To Daniel, it looked like hope. He set the mother gently on the ground, rolling up his sleeves as if standing in front of an engine waiting for repair. The soldiers muttered, some shaking their heads. They could not see how these dead machines could save a life, but Daniel ignored their doubts. He dug through metal pieces, pulling out wires, tubing, and old panels. His hands moved fast, fueled by desperation. The child watched him closely, her glowing eyes wide. For the first time, her grip on the dagger loosened, resting against her side. She whispered something to her mother, who stirred faintly, though her breath was still weak. Daniel's plan was simple in his mind. He needed to stop the blood loss and keep her alive long enough for real help. He tore open a power core, sparks flying, and rigged a small pump from the parts. His fingers worked with skill born not of training but of years repairing ships with nothing but scraps. He shaped tubes into makeshift veins, creating a crude device that could push life back where it was slipping away. The soldiers stepped closer, drawn by his speed. One asked sharply what he was doing, but the child interrupted, her voice fierce despite her trembling. She defended him, pointing to the tools and then to her mother as though saying his hands were her only chance. Her small frame shook with courage, and Daniel felt the weight of her trust settle on him. He could not fail now. At last he pressed the crude device against the mother's wounds, connecting it with careful precision. The machine hummed weakly, the tubes glowing faintly as power flowed. The mother gasped, her chest rising stronger for a moment. Her eyes flickered open, glowing softly as they found her child's face. A faint smile touched her lips before she slipped back into uneasy rest. Relief washed over Daniel. It was not a cure, not even close, but it bought them time. Time meant hope. The child's tears fell freely now, though they were mixed with a trembling smile. She reached out and touched his hand, whispering his name again, clearer this time, as if testing the sound with care. The soldiers exchanged glances. Some still looked doubtful, others uneasy, but none could deny what they had just seen. A human, an enemy, had kept one of their own alive when their weapons could not. For the first time, suspicion in their eyes began to shift into something else, uneasy respect. But the moment of calm was shattered. A deep rumble echoed through the tunnels, shaking the chamber. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the robotic dog's sensors flared red. The soldiers snapped to alert, raising their weapons. Daniel stood, wrench in hand, his body tense. Whatever was coming was not rain, not storm, not even soldiers. It was something worse, something that hunted in the dark. The rumble grew louder, shaking the tunnel walls as dust rained down from above. The child clutched her mother's hand tightly, her glowing eyes wide with fear. The robotic dog crouched low, its metal frame tense, sensors pulsing red as it scanned the darkness. The alien soldiers fanned out, weapons raised, their armor clinking in the silence between tremors. Daniel gripped his wrench, his pulse quickening. He had seen battlefields before, but the sound that now filled the tunnel was not made by soldiers' boots. It was deeper, heavier, something alive. The echoes grew into scraping and snorting like a beast forcing its way through stone. Then the shadows shifted. From the far end of the chamber, a hulking figure emerged. Its body was armored in thick scales, its eyes glowing a vicious yellow. The beast was larger than any man, its jaws dripping with saliva as it let out a roar that shook the chamber. The soldiers cursed under their breath, firing their rifles. Bolts of light flashed, striking the creature's hide, but it barely flinched. The shots only made it angrier. Daniel stepped in front of the mother and child without thinking. His wrench felt pitiful in his hand, compared to the monster that charged toward them, claws tearing through the stone floor. The soldiers shouted orders, their voices breaking under fear. The robotic dog leapt forward, its metal body colliding with the beast's chest, sparks flying as the two slammed into each other. The creature snarled, tossing the machine aside, but the dog landed back on its feet, growling, ready to fight again. The child screamed, her small dagger shaking in her grip. She looked ready to throw herself at the monster just to protect her mother. Daniel grabbed her shoulder, pulling her back, his voice sharp but steady. He told her to stay behind him, to trust him. Her glowing eyes locked on his, and for the first time she obeyed without protest. She stepped back, pressing close to her mother, tears streaking down her face. The beast lunged again, soldiers scattering as its claws swiped through the air. Daniel's mind raced like gears in an engine. He could not match its strength, but maybe he could use the chamber itself. His eyes darted to the broken machines stacked along the walls, heavy, unstable piles of rusted metal. An idea sparked. He shouted at the soldiers to draw the beast closer to the far wall. They hesitated, unwilling to take orders from a human, but the child cried out fiercely in their language, pointing at him. Her voice carried the command her people respected. The soldiers obeyed. They fired at the monster, luring it toward the wall of machines. Daniel rushed to the side, wrench in hand, and jammed it into a rusted support beam holding the pile upright. He strained with all his strength, the beam groaning, metal shrieking as the old frame gave way. The beast slammed into the wall, roaring just as Daniel wrenched the beam free. With a thunderous crash, the pile of machines collapsed, burying the creature under tons of rusted steel. The tunnel shook, dust filling the air. For a long moment, silence followed. Then the rubble shifted, but only weakly. The beast roared once more before its voice faded into a muffled growl. It was trapped for now. Daniel stood, chest heaving, his face slick with sweat and rain. He looked back at the child, who stared at him with wide, glowing eyes. She dropped her dagger to the ground, her small hands trembling as she whispered his name again, this time like a prayer. The soldiers lowered their weapons, some nodding reluctantly in his direction. The robotic dog limped back to the group, sparks trailing from its side, but its glowing eyes still burned with fight. Daniel knelt by it, tightening a loose plate with his wrench, whispering that it had done well. The machine whirred softly, almost like a purr, before rising again to stand guard. The mother stirred faintly, her breath shallow but steady. The crude device Daniel had built was still working, humming weakly, buying her more time. He glanced down the tunnel ahead, the darkness waiting like another threat. They could not stay here. Soldiers might still find them, and more beasts could be roaming the underground. He wiped his hands on his soaked clothes, lifted the mother again, and told the group they had to keep moving. The child walked beside him, no longer pointing her dagger but gripping his sleeve instead. Her trust was fragile, but it was growing. Daniel felt the weight of it pressing on him heavier than the wrench in his hand. He had become more than a stranger in the dark. To her, he was now the one holding the line between death and hope. The tunnels grew narrower as they pressed on, the echoes of the beast's roar still trembling in the stone behind them. Every step was heavy with exhaustion, but stopping meant death. Daniel carried the mother again, her body light in his arms only because she had grown weaker. Her skin was colder now, though the crude device still hummed faintly, pushing life back into her veins. The child walked at his side, clutching his sleeve tightly, her glowing eyes searching every shadow. The robotic dog padded ahead, limping but unyielding, its sensors flickering as it scanned for threats. The alien soldiers spoke in low voices, their gazes darting often toward Daniel. Suspicion had not fully left their eyes, but the memory of the beast trapped under the rubble kept their hands from their weapons. One of them finally broke the silence, speaking in a sharp tone. The child listened, then turned to Daniel. She pointed ahead to where the tunnel split into two paths. Her expression was troubled. She did not know which road would lead to safety. Daniel studied the tunnels. The left path sloped downward, water trickling along its floor. The right path climbed upward, its walls scarred with claw marks. Neither looked safe. He closed his eyes for a moment, thinking like a mechanic again. Water meant there might be an old maintenance hub below, supplies, maybe even power. The upward path meant escape to the surface, but also risk of running into soldiers. He opened his eyes and told them to go left. His voice was firm, even though doubt gnawed at him. They followed the water's trail, the tunnel air growing colder with each step. The dripping turned into a steady stream, leading them into a cavernous chamber. Old machines lined the walls, their surfaces corroded but still humming faintly with forgotten energy. Broken screens flickered to life as the group entered, casting eerie light across the room. It was a maintenance hub, abandoned but not dead. Daniel's heart lifted slightly. He set the mother down on a metal platform and immediately began searching the machines. His fingers traced panels, pulled at wires, scavenging parts with the speed of someone who had done this his whole life. The soldiers watched silently while the child stood close to her mother, whispering words that were both lullaby and promise. The robotic dog circled the room, growling low whenever sparks flickered too suddenly. Daniel found what he needed, an old medical kit, buried under a collapsed shelf, still sealed in its container. His hand shook as he opened it, relief flooding him at the sight of sterile bandages, vials, and tools. He worked quickly, replacing his crude device with something steadier. The mother flinched as he pressed needles into her arm, but her breathing steadied, her chest rising a little stronger. For the first time, Daniel felt hope that she might live longer than a few hours. The child's tears shimmered in the glow of the machines. She touched her mother's face gently, then turned to Daniel with eyes filled with gratitude and fear. She spoke his name softly, but this time she added words he could not understand. Her tone, though, was clear. She was asking him not only to save her mother, but to stay with them. Before Daniel could answer, the robotic dog growled sharply. Its sensors flared red and the soldiers raised their weapons. From the tunnel they had left behind came new sounds. Voices, boots, the cold, steady rhythm of soldiers hunting through the dark. Their glow of weapons flickered faintly at the far end of the chamber. The enemy had found the trail of water too. Panic rippled through the group. The soldiers shouted. The child clung to her mother and Daniel grabbed his wrench. He knew the hub gave them supplies, but it was also a trap. If soldiers swarmed in, they would all die here. His eyes darted around the chamber, searching for another way out. At the far wall he spotted a collapsed vent. Narrow, dangerous, but maybe large enough for the child and the mother to pass through if cleared. He turned to the soldiers, pointing at the vent, shouting that they had to move now. They hesitated, unwilling to take orders from him again. The child, however, shouted with all her voice, her words echoing through the chamber, carrying a weight beyond her years. The soldiers faltered, then obeyed. Daniel pulled at the rubble, his muscles burning as stones and metal fell aside. The robotic dog dug with its claws, sparks flying as it cleared the way. Behind them, the soldiers' voices grew louder, closer, the glow of their rifles staining the tunnel red. Time was breaking apart like glass. The vent cracked open with a screech, revealing a path barely wide enough for escape. Daniel lifted the mother again, his body trembling under her weight, and pushed her toward the opening. The child went next, crawling into the narrow space. The robotic dog followed, its frame scraping the walls. The soldiers poured fire toward the tunnel entrance, trying to hold off the enemy as long as possible. Daniel's heart pounded as he looked back at the flickering lights and the shadows moving closer. He knew the fight was not over. It had only just begun. The vent was narrow, scraping against Daniel's shoulders as he pushed himself through. The mother's limp body had been dragged ahead by the soldiers, while the child crawled right behind her, whispering to keep her calm. The robotic dog's metal frame squealed against the tight walls, but it forced its way forward, sparks flickering from its joints. Behind them, the tunnel chamber erupted with gunfire. Alien soldiers who had stayed behind to cover their escape shouted war cries, their voices cut short one by one. Daniel's chest tightened, but there was no turning back. The air in the vent was hot and stale, filled with dust that burned his throat. Each push forward felt endless, his muscles aching under the weight of the wrench still clutched in his hand. He heard the child's small voice echoing ahead, trembling but determined. She whispered to her mother, promising again and again that they would make it. Daniel swallowed hard, his resolve sharpening with each word. Finally, the vent opened into a vast chamber far deeper than the tunnels above. The air was colder, almost metallic, and dim blue light pulsed from ancient machines buried in the walls. The place looked older than any war, older than even the ruins above. Pipes as thick as trees wound around the chamber, carrying unknown energy. The robotic dog leapt out first, scanning the space, its sensors flickering yellow now instead of red. For once, there was no immediate threat. Daniel helped pull the mother through, laying her gently on the cold metal floor. The child scrambled beside her, holding her hand with both of her small ones, whispering soft words. The mother's eyes flickered open faintly, her breath uneven but still alive. Daniel wiped the sweat from his face, his chest heaving with exhaustion. He had carried her so far, but the journey was only dragging them deeper into the unknown. The alien soldiers that had escaped with them emerged next, their armor dented and scorched, their faces drawn with grief for those left behind. Their leader, a scarred veteran, spoke sharply, pointing at Daniel, then at the mother. The child responded before Daniel could, her voice filled with defiance. She stood between them and the human again, dagger raised, her glowing eyes fierce despite her tears. The veteran fell silent, his jaw tightening. He lowered his weapon reluctantly, though distrust lingered in his eyes. Daniel ignored the tension and studied the machines around them. They hummed faintly, ancient but alive. He touched one of the panels, and a weak glow flared to life. His mechanic's mind stirred, recognizing patterns, symbols, systems that reminded him of ships long before the war. If he could understand these machines, maybe he could build something stronger than the crude device keeping the mother alive, something that could save her for real. The child noticed his focus and stepped closer. She pointed to her mother, then to the machines, her voice pleading. Daniel nodded, tightening his grip on the wrench. He did not promise with words, but his determination was clear. As he worked, the chamber filled with a low hum, lights flickering brighter. The robotic dog paced near the entrance, growling at shadows. The soldiers muttered among themselves, some pointing at the machines nervously as if awakening them was dangerous. Daniel didn't stop. He rewired panels, connected tubing, and scavenged energy from one old reactor. The sparks lit his face, sweat dripping into his eyes, but his hands never slowed. At last, a stronger device came alive, small, glowing tubes pulsing with a steady rhythm. He attached them carefully to the mother, her chest rising and falling with new strength. The sound of her breathing steadied, no longer ragged but rhythmic. The child gasped, pressing her forehead to her mother's hand, tears spilling freely. She turned to Daniel and spoke his name again, this time not like a plea but like an oath. The moment of relief was short-lived. The robotic dog barked in its metallic tone, sensors flashing red once more. From the tunnels above, a new sound echoed down. Marching, not just a squad, but an army. The vibrations shook the chamber walls as the glow of enemy rifles flickered faintly in the distance. The alien soldiers looked at one another with grim acceptance. They had escaped the beast, survived the collapse, and even found hope in this chamber. But the war above had finally reached them. Daniel stood, wrench in hand, his eyes fixed on the child and her mother. He knew he could not abandon them, not now. Whatever came next, his tools would have to fight against swords once again. The hum of the ancient chamber grew louder as the marching sounds closed in. The metallic rhythm of hundreds of boots shook the tunnels above, echoing down like a storm of steel. The alien soldiers in the chamber tightened their grips on weapons, their eyes hard with grim resolve. They knew what was coming. The child clutched her mother's hand, her glowing eyes wide with fear, while the robotic dog crouched at the chamber's entrance, growling low as its sensors flared bright red. Daniel stood in the center, wrench in hand, sweat dripping from his brow. He looked at the mother, her chest rising stronger thanks to the device he had built, and then at the child. In her small, trembling face he saw more than fear. He saw the same desperate hope he carried. He could not let it be crushed by the wave of soldiers about to pour into the chamber. The scarred alien veteran barked orders, rallying the survivors. They took positions near the walls, their battered rifles aimed at the tunnel entrance. They were few, tired and wounded, but they would not give up without a fight. Daniel knew their weapons could only delay the inevitable. Numbers would crush them. He turned his eyes to the ancient machines glowing faintly in the chamber. These walls held more than rust. They held power, and power could be turned into survival. He ran to a massive console, its surface cracked and half dead, and began tearing it open with his wrench. Sparks burst as he rewired circuits, his hands moving with frantic precision. The soldiers shouted in confusion, but the child understood. She pointed at him, her voice fierce, telling them to hold the line. They hesitated, but obeyed her, their rifles spitting light into the dark tunnel just as the first enemy soldiers appeared. The enemy poured in like a flood, armored figures firing red bolts that lit up the chamber. The surviving soldiers screamed defiance, answering with fire of their own, the air filled with smoke, sparks, and the screams of battle. The robotic dog leapt into the fray, its metal jaws clamping down on an enemy soldier, tearing him from his feet before spinning to slash at another. Sparks flew from its body as bolts struck its frame, but it fought on with machine fury. Daniel worked faster, pulling a thick cable free and jamming it into a glowing coil. The chamber lights flared, old engines groaning awake after years of silence. Energy surged through the walls, humming like the roar of some long-dead giant. He shouted at the child to keep her head down, his voice barely carrying over the storm of gunfire. The mother stirred faintly, her eyes fluttering open. She whispered weakly, her voice no more than a breath, but the child leaned close, hearing every word. Tears streaked her glowing cheeks as she nodded, then turned her gaze back to Daniel with a fire stronger than before. She was not only guarding her mother now, she was standing for her will. The enemy advanced deeper into the chamber, forcing the survivors back step by step. The scarred veteran fought like a man who had nothing left to lose, cutting down enemies until he was dragged into the chaos. The child screamed, but Daniel shouted for her to stay down, his hands never stopping on the console. At last the machine roared to life. Panels glowed bright blue, the floor shaking as the old chamber awoke fully. A surge of energy exploded from the walls, throwing enemy soldiers back in a blinding flash. Arcs of lightning crackled through the chamber, striking armor, frying weapons, filling the air with the sharp smell of ozone. The survivors staggered but held their ground. Daniel shielded his face, the wrench still clutched in his hand as the ancient power turned the chamber into a storm of light. When the glow faded, dozens of enemy soldiers lay broken, their armor smoking. The survivors gasped, staring at the walls now pulsing with power. Daniel dropped to one knee, chest heaving, his hands burned from the surge but alive. He looked at the child. She stared back at him with awe, her small lips parting to whisper his name once more. But this time the word carried something new. Faith. The robotic dog limped back, its frame cracked and sparking but still standing. The mother's breathing steadied even more, her chest rising with strength borrowed from the machines. The chamber had become more than shelter. It had become a weapon. Yet outside the war raged on, and Daniel knew the final battle was still to come. The chamber still glowed with ancient power, the walls pulsing faintly like the heartbeat of something alive. The air smelled of burned metal and smoke, the silence broken only by the distant thunder of war above. Daniel leaned against the console, his hands burned and aching, but his eyes steady. Around him, the few surviving soldiers stood in shock at what they had seen. A human who had turned forgotten machines into a weapon strong enough to stop an army. The child knelt by her mother, her small hands resting against the woman's chest. The mother's breathing was steadier now, her skin warmer as the device Daniel had built pulsed with the chamber's power. Slowly, her eyes opened, glowing faintly. She looked at her daughter first, then at Daniel. Her lips moved, whispering soft words. Though Daniel did not know the language, he understood the meaning in her gaze. Gratitude. The child turned toward him, her glowing eyes shining with tears and light. She spoke his name clearly, no longer broken or hesitant, but strong. She stood and took his hand, holding it tightly in both of hers. For a moment there were no soldiers, no beasts, no storm above. There was only a bond born in blood, fire, and tools that had proven kinder than swords. But the silence did not last. The scarred veteran approached, his face grim. He pointed toward the tunnels, his voice sharp. More soldiers were coming. The chamber had given them a chance, but not an end. The war outside still raged, and the enemy would not stop until every survivor here was dead. Daniel's jaw tightened. He had kept the mother alive, but now he had to ensure they could escape. He turned to the machines, his mind racing. The chamber was more than a tomb of old power, it was a doorway. Pipes ran upward, connecting to the surface. Energy surged in patterns he recognized, patterns that could be harnessed. He realized with sudden clarity that he could not only defend this place, he could open it, turn the chamber into a beacon, a shield, a way to drive back the enemy long enough for them to flee. The soldiers shouted as the sound of marching grew closer again. The robotic dog barked sharply, its sensors flaring red. Daniel moved quickly, wrench in hand, twisting knobs, crossing wires, forcing the ancient system into life. The chamber groaned, lights flaring brighter, the hum rising into a roar. The walls themselves began to tremble, dust falling in streams as power built higher and higher. The child cried out, afraid, but Daniel shouted for her to hold on, his voice steady. He told her this was their chance, their only chance. She clutched her mother tighter, whispering prayers as the machines howled around them. The enemy poured into the tunnels just as Daniel slammed his wrench down on the final switch. Light erupted, a wave of pure energy blasting through the passageways. The soldiers screamed as the blast tore through them, their weapons shattering, their armor burning. The tunnel shook violently, collapsing behind them, sealing the path with tons of stone. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of the machines winding down. The chamber still glowed faintly, but the surge was gone. Daniel staggered, dropping to one knee, his chest heaving. He had bought them time, maybe enough to live, maybe enough to escape. The mother's voice, weak but steady now, broke the silence. She spoke in her tongue, her hand reaching toward Daniel. The child translated with simple words, her voice trembling with emotion. She said her mother called him not stranger, not enemy, but protector. Daniel bowed his head, unsure how to answer. He had not come to be a hero. He had only followed the promise of his tools, the belief that even in war, fixing what was broken mattered more than breaking what was whole. The scarred veteran finally lowered his weapon and gave a slow nod. One by one, the other soldiers followed. In that moment, they accepted him, not as an outsider, but as one of their own. The child stood, her small hand slipping into his again. She whispered softly, asking if he would stay. Daniel looked at her, then at her mother, and at the faces of those who had survived because he refused to give up. His tired lips curved into the faintest smile. He told her as long as he lived, his tools would always be kinder than swords. And together, with the storm fading above and the tunnels sealed behind, they stepped forward, not as enemies, but as a family born in the fire of war, carrying with them the fragile hope of something better.